Her own family turned their backs on her. No one in town expected the quiet farmer to do what he did next. Helena had learned the art of getting up before light. There was a rhythm to it she could name in her sleep. The creak of the back gate, the soft slap of dough against a wooden board, the hiss of steam from the oven when the first loaf went in. The bakery smelled like the promise of small things: warm yeast, butter, sugar caramelizing on the edge of a pastry. In those first hours, before the town opened its shutters, she could be someone else for a little while. Careful, competent, invisible in the way that keeps you safe. She folded the dough with hands calloused from years of work, hands that had learned steadiness out of necessity. You could read her life in those hands, the straight ridge on the knuckle where a childhood fall never quite smoothed, the thin white scar near the wrist from a pan that slipped. The faint patch of roughness at the base of the thumb from kneading the same way, day after day, for more than a decade. Each mark was a sentence in a story she rarely told aloud. Very few people in the town of Campos Verdes bothered to listen anyway. By 32, Helena had become the backbone of a tiny neighborhood bakery that smelled like Sunday mornings and second chances. The owner, Señor Almeida, paid her in cash and trusted her with the till. He had a habit of humming hymns while he dusted flour off his hands, and he liked to say that work straightened a bent life. People came for the bread and stayed for the way she wrapped each purchase like a small treasure. 2 rolls tucked in a paper bag, a pie wrapped and tied with string. She learned to fold kindness into simple things. Her past rested behind the bakery like a storm cloud. There were afternoons when she would pause with a tray in her hands and feel the old weight settle on her shoulders. Mother's sharp voice trimming her like a hedge, brothers who laughed at dreams as if they were jokes left over from someone else's life. Donna Yvonne had a way of making her daughter small while everyone watched, calling her clumsy, reminding any visitor of past failings, making Helena's mistakes the town's small entertainment. Marcos and João, her brothers, had grown loud as men do when they want to be believed. Their jokes stopped being playful when they were directed at Helena's heart. Once, when Helena was a girl of 12, she had stood in the doorway of their narrow home while Donna Yvonne counted coins at the table. The light from the street lamp folded into the room like an uninvited guest, and Helena had hoped, absurdly, that a hand would reach out to steady hers. Instead, her mother's voice cut across the kitchen like a scolding wind. "You always make life harder than it needs to be." Helena learned then to hold her breath and make herself small. She learned the economy of silence. The Bible she kept, soft from use, with a cracked spine and pages thumbed thin, had been a gift from a neighbor who had taught her to read. It sat on a shelf in a back room of the bakery, smudged with flour and the occasional spill of coffee, a quiet companion to rituals she did not always name. Sometimes, on slow afternoons when heat lay heavy across the town, she would sit on the stoop behind the bakery and trace favorite verses with a flour-dusted fingertip, not because she expected miracles, but because words can be anchors when the tide of life feels turbulent. It was in that slow, ordinary life that the man from the country began to appear. He came first like a shadow at dawn, then like regular weather. Every morning at the same hour, while the sky still held the thin blue of before day, a pair of boots tramped up the bakery steps. His coat smelled faintly of earth and tobacco. His hands were wide, the knuckles reddened and cracked from work. He did not speak much, never more than needed, but his eyes were a steady kind of presence, like an anchored stone. Helena noticed the small things about him that told stories, the way his hat was sun-faded along the brim, the faint scratches on his forearms where hedgerow briars had taken their marks, the slow, economical way he counted his coins, as if he had an accounting for every grain of the world. He paid for his bread and left a space in the bakery that wasn't filled by words, but by a kind of recognition she had never felt before. When she handed him the paper bag, her fingers brushed his, and for a second she registered warmth like a lighthouse beam. "Bom dia," he said the first time, in a voice that did not try to be heard beyond politeness. He left with a loaf wrapped like a secret and a nod that felt like permission. In the weeks that followed, those small nods piled into something she could live in. He called himself Sebastio when he was asked his name, and Helena learned the geography of his life in fragments. A modest farm outside town, a house painted white enough to show the shadows of clouds, a widow's life he kept to himself. No photos, no long stories. Just the kind of quiet that does things rather than say them. One morning, after a heavy overnight rain that turned the dirt road leading to the bakery into a ribbon of sticky mud, Sebastian stayed longer than usual. He watched Helena with an attention that had nothing prying about it, only a plain curiosity. At the counter, steam rose from a basket of croissants. The town began to stir, shutters opening like eyelids. "You look tired," he offered once, more a fact than a question. Helena shrugged, the smallest motion. "Work never sleeps." He considered the words. Then, to everyone's mild surprise, he said, "I need a hand at the farm. If you ever wanted a change, there's a place to sleep, food, and honest work. My wife used to make the bread she liked. I try to keep things like that." It was not a declaration. It was an offer set down gently, as if he might offend something delicate by pressing too hard. People in town raised their eyebrows aside from the bakery door. Offers like that were rare and often came tangled with expectations. But there was something in the way he looked at her, respectful, patient, that made the idea sensible in a way she hadn't expected. To Helena, who had learned that offers were usually transactions and affection a commodity, this felt oddly pure. She did not accept immediately. She went home that night to the small room she had rented since leaving her mother's house years ago. A single bed, a thin mattress, a shelf with a kettle and 2 cups. She sat on the edge and held the Bible, running a fingertip over the creased back cover until the shape of the letters felt like a promise. The idea of leaving the bakery terrified her. It also carried the odd scent of possibility. 3 days later, she took him up on it. The ride to the farm was a lesson in landscape. The town's asphalt gave way to gravel, then to lane that narrowed until hedges brushed both sides of the cart. Dust floated up behind the truck like a memory. Birds fled in the high grass. As they drove, Sebastian spoke of small things. The orchard where pears blossomed in spring, a well that sometimes stuttered but always gave, the shed where the tools hung precisely. He spoke of women in the town who could mend a roof and of a harvest last year that had come just enough to keep worry from the pantry. When they arrived, the farmhouse stood with a modest dignity. Whitewashed walls, a porch with a rope swing, shutters open as if to breathe in the field. Chickens wandered freely. A dog, old and steady, lifted its head and patted over with the kind of welcome reserved for those who have always belonged to a place. There was order here that was not domineering, simple systems that let life run with less friction, chores that divided the day into manageable lines, nights that folded into routines. Helena was given a room that had been painted the color of sunlit wheat. There was a blanket on the bed and a small wooden table by the window. For the first time in years, she had a space that belonged only to her. She slept with the window open and listened to the wind negotiate with the orchard. In the morning, she woke to the smell of earth and coffee, to the distant bleating of goats, and to a kind of peace that was new and unnerving. Work at the farm was honest and filling. At first, everything ached. Her shoulders, her back, the small muscles in her hands that weren't used to lifting bales or mending fences. But there was a rhythm to the labor that felt like a prayer without words. Planting, tending, harvesting, the physicality of it was steadying. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the light thicken into purple. He would make a pot of soup and leave a bowl on the table for her before he went to check on the cattle. She would slice bread and set it beside his plate without ceremony. Small gestures taught her how trust could grow. He tied a loose strap on her boot without fuss. When a storm tore branches from the orchard, he sent her to fetch a blanket and sat with her while the thunder passed. He did not ask about her past in the explosive, prying way her family had. Instead, he listened to the things she offered, a complaint about a sleep that would not come, a memory of a broken window fixed by a neighbor's boy years ago. He did not judge. He named the fruit on the trees and showed her how to tell when the eggs were fresh. He called out instructions with a voice like dry earth, clear, practical, not overbearing. It was in these ordinary lessons that she learned to accept being seen. The town noticed the change before she did, small rumors like soft rain. Señor Almeida said she moved differently now, less hunched, the way someone who has been allowed rest stands taller. The pastor commented once, at the end of a service, that people seem to walk with more lightness these days. A neighbor at the market, Maria, confided that she had seen Helena come into town carrying baskets with a quiet pride she had never seen before. Yet the past is rarely content to stay buried under new weather. Donna Ivone heard about the farm as mothers hear gossip at the well, quickly, with a particular kind of hunger. The thing about men like Marcos and João, loud and easy to persuade, was that they carried resentment like a muscle. When a woman who had been spoken of as a burden stepped out of her family's orbit and into a life of dignity, it cried out to them like a slight that needed righting. What hurt them most, perhaps, was plain. Someone they had treated as expendable had discovered peace and a companion willing to protect it. One afternoon, as the sun lowered and painted the market stalls a honeyed yellow, Donna Ivone appeared at Señor Almeida's door like an accusation. She moved with a speed that negated her years, a length of voice that trusted rumor to do most of the work. Marcos and João were with her, their shirt sleeves rolled, the town's gossip wrapped around their hands like banners. They did not come asking, no, they came claiming. "You know how it is," Marcos said, loud enough that the town's 2 or 3 midday customers heard. "We're here to bring our sister home. She belongs with her family. There are things to clear up." Helena was slicing dough at the back when the voices reached her. She set the knife down with the precision of habit and wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to the front like someone who had rehearsed her exit 1,000 times and then refused to do it again. The bakery smelled suddenly tight, like a room with too little air. Donna Ivone's eyes were small and bright, as if lit from within by a candle of grievance. "You shouldn't be out here on your own," she told Helena before greeting anyone else. "People talk. It's not right." Helena felt the town turn its head. Conversations quieted. The bakery's bell hummed like a warning. In the midst of this, Sebastião arrived as if drawn by the thread of the disturbance. He stepped up to the counter with the silence that had become his language and met Donna Ivone's stare with a calm that could steady a boat. "You're making a scene," he said, not with anger, but by naming the fact. "If there's something you need to talk about, we can talk, not like this." There was a moment, small as a held breath, when the air considered whether to break. Donna Ivone bristled. "She needs to come home," she insisted. "There, just like that. There are matters to be sorted." Helena, who had learned decades ago to shrink away from demands, surprised herself. She said nothing at first. Then she looked at the people gathered, at Señor Almeida, at neighbors leaning out of doors, at the kids with their pockets empty of judgment, and said, with a voice that felt like it came from some hard-won place, "I have a life." Her family's answer came not in words but in what followed, the brothers' low, bitter chuckles, the look that suggested they would make the town into an ally for their cause. It was not yet clear what their cause was. They spoke of rumors, of shame, of debts owed, an old pattern of blaming the vulnerable for the family's discomfort. In the days that followed, they returned again and again to Town Square, asking questions loud enough that reporters from a local station, hungry for scandal, began to take notice. It began as whispers but acquired a shape. Helena, as someone who had left her obligations, someone who maybe, the voice on a local broadcast might suggest, was hiding things. When the first camera showed up, no one in Campos Verdes believed the story would amount to anything. It was a small station from the next valley over, more accustomed to covering municipal council meetings than personal feuds. But the camera created its own logic. A lens makes rumor into spectacle. A microphone invites accusation to become content. Helena felt the world close like a fist. The phone she had kept in a drawer, an old model with a cracked screen, began to ring with numbers she didn't know. The bakery's door hardly closed before a pickup truck rolled into the square, and a man with a tripod and a face made sharp by city lights asked to speak with her family. Sebastian watched all of this with a patience that had in it a cold steel. No one expected him to move beyond the sort of protective attentions he had already shown, leaving an extra bowl of soup, taking the broken roof tile down to be mended, offering a quiet presence. But when the trucks arrived and the camera's light painted the square in uncomfortable tones, he shifted from presence to action. He stepped forward, not loudly, not theatrically, but with a solidity that made people make room. He stood in front of Helena as if by instinct, his body a quiet shield between her and the flash. The reporters asked questions that sounded like stones thrown into a pond. "Is this true? Are you taking her from her family? Why did she leave?" The brothers provided a chorus of accusation that fell into microphones with practiced ease. The town murmured, opinions dividing like weather fronts. Sebastian listened. Then, in a voice that surprised everyone with its steadiness, he said, "You're asking questions that belong to her life. If you want the truth, you'll wait for it to be given, but you won't do it by making her less for the sake of a headline." It was not the kind of speech that television loves, no shouting, no flourish, but it had an authority that shifted the room. For one breath, the camera hesitated. The reporter, trained to prod, blinked as if calibrating how to turn stillness into copy. The brothers bristled as if the farmer had taken something they expected to keep. What followed was not a clash of fists and flags, but a quieter escalation. A rumor spiraled into accusation, an accusation reached for verification the way fire reaches for tinder. Papers were signed in town hall offices 3 days later by people who called themselves neighbors, signing affidavits about things they had not been present to see. A local journalist called, pressing for comment. A detective, unfamiliar with the contours of small-town histories, asked for records. The weight of being known slipped into a different kind of peril, being known not as a person but as a story. Helena found herself back in old patterns without quite understanding how. Her hands trembled as she kneaded dough that week. Her sleep came in shreds. When she locked herself in her sunlit room at the farm, she traced the Bible's worn cover and let the words blur. She could feel, faint and distant, the old ache of being judged only by the worst parts someone else chose to tell. Sebastio would come to the kitchen at odd hours, not to ask questions but to sit at the table and keep time with her. He would bring a cup of coffee, sometimes black and strong, and set it down in front of her like an offering. He would say nothing about the cameras. He would say nothing about the signatures. Instead, he taught her small things to ground herself, how to check egg freshness, how to tell when a pear would sweeten on the tree, how to mend a tear so it looks as if the fabric has always been whole. It was in the middle of one such night, when the rain had returned and the porch shook with the sound of it, that the brothers came to the farm. They had driven in the dark, their headlights cutting through the rows like accusing eyes. They announced themselves with impatience, a banging on the door that woke the dog and then brought silence, a taut, listening silence. Helena's pulse pushed against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stood with her hands at her sides, the Bible tucked under arm like a talisman. Donna Ivone's voice was different here, half pleading, half commanding. "Helena, come home. You must come home." "We've been looking for you," Marco said, softer now, as if the farm's air had smoothed something rough in him. But the softness carried threat. Coming to fetch someone who no longer wants to be fetched is a maneuver that presupposes force. Sebastio answered the door. He looked at them, at the three forms silhouetted in the porch light, with a patience that had reached the edge of being something else. The slow, cool kind of resolve that is not loud, but very difficult to move. "You can't keep making scenes in town," he said. "If you have concerns, speak plainly. Don't tear someone's life apart." For a heartbeat, the family debated like a storm under sails. Then Marcos's voice, high with a type of resentment that had waited years to be voiced, said, "We know things. People know things." "You make claims because it flatters you to be believed," Sebastien replied. His voice stayed low, like land that will hold. "If you're hurting, find a way without hurting her." Donna Ivone, not used to being refused, folded the conversation into a threat. "If you protect her, you make enemies of us." Sebastio's response came simple and unexpectedly final. "I'll protect what's here." It was not bravado. It was not the kind of promise that courts headlines. It was a fact laid down. Even in the dim light, his face was steady. The brothers looked at each other, offended as if challenged to prove their right to hurt. They left that night with words that clung to the edges of town talk. The next morning, news vans circled like birds over a field. A reporter's drone buzzed above the orchard where the pears were still swelling toward ripeness. Someone in Campos Verdes put a rumor into the local paper. Helena accused of abandoning obligations, the farmer who sheltered her implicated by association. The rumor rolled downhill and gathered weight. Helena felt the town's gaze as a collection of knives. In the bakery, the usual customers shuffled in, quieter than before, their purchases smaller, their eyes curious and then furtive. At the farm, letters arrived, anonymous notes with accusations, names scrawled with anger. It was a siege that relied on whispers and a camera's hunger for spectacle. It was not violent in the way that breaks bones, but it bruised where memories still remember. In the face of this, the quiet farmer, moved by something broader than mere pride, took a step that nobody had expected. He did not go to the microphones, not at first. He did not shout on the square. Instead, he walked into town with his hat in his hand and a slow, measured gait. He met the reporter whose face had become a recurring shadow in their doorframe and asked simply to be allowed to speak with the truth before the story wrote itself. He sought witnesses who could speak to Helena's life with factual clarity, the bakery owner who could confirm her schedule, neighbors who had seen her at church and in the market, the teacher from her childhood who remembered a girl who worked and learned and loved in quiet corners. Word spread that the farmer was refusing to be dramatized. He was, rather, documenting the ordinary. He brought the town into a pattern they were not used to, that of evidence, of named truth, of patience applied like steady work. This, more than any clinic of words, began to turn something. Yet the brothers were not easily dissuaded. They had learned that damage done quietly is damage done forever. They continued to fan the flame, speaking into recorders and telling partial stories. They found an old neighbor to say that Helena had left under suspicious circumstances. They showed a wrinkled receipt that they claimed proved something. Proof that upon closer scrutiny turned out to be a small piece of an ordinary ledger. Still, the camera loved the friction. The village square became a theater. People lent their voices like a chorus. Late one evening, after a day spent stacking crates in the orchard, Helena sat on the farm's back steps and watched the town's lights blink in the distance. A cicada sang like a long memory. Sebastian sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers in a way that did not ask permission and did not demand repayment. "They will not stop," Helena said, the truth held not as complaint, but as a fact of the world. "Then we do not let them set the terms," he answered. "We live as we are." She thought of her mother's voice, the shape of it like a shadow against the years. She thought of the Bible's creased pages. She thought of being held up in the middle of a public square by someone who had stepped into her life quietly and stayed. Something in her loosened. Yet, as the lights in town blinked and the cicadas kept time, she knew the path ahead would not be smoothed by the orchard's order. It would take witnesses and patience, courage, and the slow assembling of facts. It would require friends who could name the truth without spectacle. It might mean that the farmer, the man who never raised his voice, would have to do things he had never imagined. He might have to stand not only in the doorway, but under the bright, unyielding light of scrutiny, and say the words that will define the story for others. When the first camera lights warmed the square again, people leaned in with the expectancy of an audience waiting for the reveal. The brothers were there, loud and certain. Donna Yvonne wore her grievance like a fine shawl. Reporters shuffled papers and cleared throats. The community's curiosity had become a pressure that could crack helpful things. But it was the silent farmer who stepped forward as if the moment had been waiting for him all along. He did not shout, he did not plead, he did not perform. Instead, he stood in front of Helena and slowly, with a steadiness that made the camera linger, opened his jacket and laid an object on the counter as if offering a relic. People leaned forward. He called a witness, Senor Almeida, who told of the hours Helena had spent at the bakery, of the kindnesses she had handed out like bread. No one in Campos Verdes expected what the quiet man would do next. The camera's red light found his face, and the look there was not of showmanship but of steadfastness. For once, the town held its breath, waiting to see whether truth, told without the need for fury, could hold against a storm of rumor. The first words from the reporter were tentative, waiting for permission to shape the moment. The brothers tightened their shoulders, ready to press whatever advantage they could manufacture. Donna Yvonne watched as if calculating the next move. And Helena, standing in the center of the sudden attention with her hands folded as if she had returned to the act of kneading dough, felt the old fear rise. But beneath it, a firmer thing, the sense that she was not standing alone. Outside, the orchard waited, as always, with its quiet promise of fruit to come. Inside the square, the town waited, as always, for a story to fit its appetite. Between the two, a man who did not raise his voice had chosen to act. The microphones leaned in, the camera lensed the farmer's calm face, The brothers' murmurs rose like a challenge. The town's heartbeat quickened. At that precise moment, when anticipation balanced on a knife edge, a figure appeared at the square's edge, someone no one yet expected to join this small theater of accusation and defense. A woman in the crowd stepped forward before anyone else could move. She wore the blue vest of the community health center and carried a clipboard. But more than that, she carried a calm that seemed to have been practiced in rooms where people are used to unraveling complications. Dr. Mariana Carvalho, lawyer and social worker, who had driven up that morning after a call from Senor Almeida. In a town where every face was known, hers was new enough to make people tune their ears differently. She moved with quick, unobtrusive competence, a presence that asked questions without accusation. Her eyes found Helena first, then lingered on the farmer's steady profile. There was no fanfare. She introduced herself to the reporter, soft, direct, and asked for a minute to speak with those present. The camera kept rolling. The microphone hovered like a white insect, hungry for friction. Mariana's voice did not feed it. She asked for witnesses, for documents, for names and dates. She asked the kind of plain questions that force a story back into facts. People began to speak. Senor Almeida, honest and blunt as bread, repeated that Helena had been at the bakery every dawn for years. Maria from the market, who had more gossip than gold, but also a habit of noticing small truths, said she had seen Helena at church on Sundays, standing in the back pew with an apron still smelling of flour. The retired teacher from the primary school, a woman with spectacles that liked to fall down her nose, remembered Helena as the girl who stayed after class to help tidy the blackboard and who read aloud to the younger children. No one spoke like a crusader. They spoke like neighbors remembering what was true. Mariana filed the names into a neat mental list. She asked for copies of any letters, any records. Someone produced a photo of an old receipt Marcos had waved at the camera days before. Mariana examined it and then, quietly, but with an intensity that drew attention, asked where it had been kept, who had handled it. The farmer, who had walked into town with the simple aim of supporting a neighbor, found himself in the center of a methodical process he had not imagined he would know how to follow. He stood still and let it unfold. Within a week, Mariana had become a constant in a life that had been unaccustomed to the presence of a figure who asked for evidence the way a doctor asks for tests. She appeared at the farmhouse with a folder of photocopies, with a list of people to interview, with the steadiness of someone who had spent countless hours listening to stories the world would rather forget. She spoke with Helena as if to a person whose name mattered. Respectful, patient, not rushed. She brought a recorder when Helena agreed, and she took notes in a narrow, neat script. The investigation, no dramatic word, just precise steps, pulled at threads the brothers had hoped would remain hidden. Records were checked against dates the family claimed certain events had occurred. Witnesses were asked to sign statements. Old invoices and payrolls, the mundane clutter of lives lived honestly, were shown to contradict allegations that had nothing to do with facts. Mariana found inconsistencies that grew like cracks in a plaster wall. Where Marcos had said one thing, receipts and neighbors said another. Where Donna Yvonne insisted on versions of events that had been repeated often enough to feel true, there were gaps and improbable leaps. It is one thing to plant a rumor in a town square. It is another to stand up to it with documents and the testimony of those who had seen the ordinary truth. The camera crews, hungry for drama, found that the story had shifted from a single salacious accusation to a more complex pattern. A family in dispute, allegations countered by dozens of neighbors, a farmer who had stood in public and asked for patience while facts were assembled. The station reporter who had first glided into town with the promise of scandal found herself faced with a stack of statements and an editor back in the city increasingly uncomfortable with a package that might carry legal risk. Mariana negotiated in the spaces between public indignation and private fact. She asked for a meeting in the station's small office with the reporter and the editor. She did not threaten, she explained. She placed documents on the table, witness accounts, timelines, the original receipts with dates that matched Helena's working days in the bakery. She described the pattern of harassment that had unfolded. Anonymous notes, nighttime visits, the brothers' repeated public accusations without substantiation. Her talk was quiet, but it had the weight of process. The editor, a man who had seen scandals fold and be retracted before, ran his fingers along the margin of a sheet and then called his supervisor. The station agreed, after much back and forth, and with language that made everyone invested feel some discomfort, to run a clarification. On Thursday evening's local news, the anchor read a statement that did not have the theatrics of an apology, but bore the gravity of acknowledgement. Parts of the earlier coverage had been incomplete. Further investigation had revealed discrepancies. The station regretted any harm caused by premature reporting. It was not an elaborate mea culpa, but in a place where words could wound, the sentence that mattered for Helena was simple. The narrator they had presented had been incomplete. In the weeks that followed, as the press shifted its tone, and prosecutors and the local police re-examined the volume of accusations that had been made, Mariana did something else just as important. She built a protective architecture around Helena and the farmhouse life. She helped get legal measures in place, orders that limited the brothers' ability to appear uninvited, notices that required distance. The language was precise and non-sensational, and Mariana insisted that it stay that way. She understood that the language of justice could itself become a weapon if wielded carelessly in a small town. Do not embarrass, she warned gently. Do not feed the cameras more than necessary. Build the case. Protect the person. There were bad days. The brothers, stung by the loss of public attention, pushed back with renewed vigor in casual conversations in market lines, with murmured accusations in church doorways. The letters continued, less frequent, more anonymous. A note once appeared taped to the bakery window with accusations written in a hand that wavered between anger and artful deceit. Helena found it folded in her apron pocket when she arrived for an early shift and held it like a small live thing. At night, the old dreams returned in fragments. The kitchen lamp swinging during an argument, a child's voice raised, the smell of cigar smoke in an adult throat. But there were repairs happening too, less dramatic, quieter, and steadying. The pastor from the small church came by the farm late one afternoon with a loaf of bread and a story about a church elder who had set aside a basket for their table. The neighbors, who had once been tempted by scandal like moths to a porch light, began to show up as witnesses of fact, not of gossip. One woman brought an old photograph of Helena helping to mend a school uniform. Another brought a note from a handyman who had fixed a pipe at the bakery and had seen Helena working into the night. Mariana taught Helena how to speak in a room where every word could matter. It was not a lesson in public performance. It was a gentle coaching in clarity. Say what you know is true. Admit what you do not know. Ask for time to gather the rest. Helena, with hands that had learned an economy of silence, learned to use a different kind of economy, the economy of careful truth. The brothers realized, in the slow collapse of their initial advantage, that their leverage depended on spectacle. As cameras retreated, and as witnesses aligned in Helena's favor, their attacks became flatter. A prosecutor eventually declined to pursue charges that lacked foundation. The local council publicly encouraged reconciliation where possible and called for respect in how disputes are aired. The town's conversations shifted from accusation to the awkward human work of reorienting how they saw one of their own. That shift did not mean immediate healing. People are slow to change habits of judgment. Helena still woke sometimes to the echo of her mother's scolding and the old reflex to disappear. She still flinched when a truck rolled into the square like an echo of a past intrusion. But each day on the farm lived like stitches in cloth, small, precise, gathering strength. Sebastian continued to do the ordinary things that had become his language of care, leaving a bowl of soup, stacking her bread by the sink so she could warm it later, fixing a loose shutter without a fanfare that might draw a camera. He tended the orchard. He taught her how to listen for weather in leaves. Those lessons were not heroic. They were habitual. They were redeeming. There were moments of unexpected tenderness that did not require speech. Once, during a long harvest day when Helena's hands had been doing the kind of work that wearies a person to the bone, Sebastian found her standing alone by the well. He handed her a cold cloth dipped in well water, and with a dry remark about how the pears would wait for no one, nudged her to sit. She sat. He sat across from her, and, without ceremony, placed his hat between them on the ground, a tiny island of shared possession. They did not speak for a long while. They watched two swallows loop over the orchard and trusted that the world went on. Slowly, the town's curiosity gave way to a quieter respect. Children who once pointed now waved. Old men who had once made jokes about Helena's supposed failings now greeted her by name. Señor Almeida continued to put out good bread and to listen to the new stories that the town offered in the softer tone of reparations. How a woman who had been written off had found a life that polished her edges. Mariana kept returning, a steady presence, and her work extended beyond the immediate legalities. She connected Helena to a support group for people who had experienced public shaming, to counselors who helped with nightmares and the ways accusations can settle like sediment in a person's bones. The community's slow shift did not come without personal confrontations. Donna Yvonne visited the farm twice more. The first time, she came with a face that was softer, as if age had worn down her edges into something malleable. She said she had come to talk things through. Helena stood on the porch and watched her approach like someone who had seen a tide and knows its behaviors. The conversation that followed was not cinematic, it was domestic and small. Donna Yvonne apologized in parts, more for the town's discomfort than for her daughter's pain, but the apology lacked the depth Helena had once craved. Mariana was there, a discreet presence on the edge of the porch. She later told Helena that apologies, when they come too late or half-made, can have the weight of a favor, not a repair. Helena listened, acknowledged the words, and chose a boundary. She accepted the apology into the shape it had, but she did not open the doors of her life wide. Marcos and João were less disposed to reconciliation. They proved to be brittle when the town's sympathy dimmed. There were phone calls, whispered threats, an anonymous note that arrived at the farmhouse with language that made the dog growl. Mariana filed motions to keep them at a distance. The court issued measures that forbade them from approaching the property. The brothers could not by law stand on the road and shout. They could not by court order linger on the courthouse steps and hurl accusations. Those legal boundaries did not change what had been said on the airwaves, but they changed the rhythm of nights at the farmhouse. They allowed Helena to sleep in a room that, though sometimes invaded by dreams, no longer felt as if strangers could step into it at noon. Through it all, Sebastio's support remained quiet and practical. There was an afternoon, late in the harvest season, when he walked into the town square and spoke without the cameras. He gathered a handful of neighbors, people who had shared benches with him in prayer meetings, men who bought his eggs, women who traded preserves, and he asked simply that they consider a posture of protection. "We are neighbors," he said. "We ought to be able to live without being tormented for our choices." No one applauded in the square. That is not how things are done in a town like Campos Verdes. But there was a movement of heads, a re-anchoring. People began to see what had seemed a scandal for what it was, a family storm, one that had threatened to flood a life. It was in the aftermath of those legal protections and the slow reorientation of the town's conscience that something less procedural and more human began to take shape. Helena found herself laughing one evening with Maria after a market day. They sat on the farm's back steps, sharing a pot of coffee so hot it steamed like a small promise. Maria told a story of a rooster that had once gotten into her cart and knocked over a crate of oranges. The absurdity of it made Helena laugh until her sides ached. It was the kind of laugh that suggested a person could be surprised by joy. One winter, months after the cameras had moved on, and the town had almost forgotten the taste of scandal, Sebastio did something that would come to be remembered not as a spectacle but as a decisive, humble act. He took Helena to the top of a small hill behind the farmhouse, where you could see the town in one sweep and the river glinting like a blade of light where it cut the valley. He had a packet tucked into his jacket pocket, nothing ornate, just a simple ring of braided silver he had carried for weeks, worrying at the metal until it fit his hand. They walked slowly. The air smelled of turned earth and winter green. He spoke then, not in a way that startled, but in a way that steadied. He told her, plain, true, what he had felt watching her face in the early mornings, what it had meant to come to the bakery and learn the names of a life she had been allowed to keep. He told her, in the quiet way he reserved for things that mattered, that he wanted to protect them, not as a mandate, not as ownership, but as partnership. He asked if she would marry him in a small ceremony on the farm, among the pears and the people who had witnessed their ordinary days. Helena, who had learned to withhold hope for its safety, felt the words sink into her like rain into soil. She did not answer at once. She let the hill hold them both, the town below like a record of what had been. She envisioned a life that had once felt impossible, a house that was hers in small but steady ways, hands that could build and mend and laugh into the dark without the fear of being claimed by other people's stories. When she said yes, her voice folded into the wind and came back softened. Their wedding, when it came, was exactly as they had planned. A small collection of neighbors, the pastor who had been a witness to their quiet acts of care, and a table heavy with bread that Helena had baked herself. The months that followed carried another unexpected blessing. Helena learned she was pregnant. The news arrived on a clear morning, the orchard full of birds. It made the house smell of sugar and possibility. She thought then of the ways her life had once been narrowed into neat condemnations, a failure, an embarrassment, someone the town would comment on in low voices. To find a child, Laura, blooming inside her, felt like rewriting a ledger line. It did not erase the past injuries. It offered a future to be tended. Pregnancy in a small town is itself a public event. People notice a woman's hands, the way she ties her apron. But in the case of Helena, the town's attention had shifted. Instead of the eager, hungry curiosity that once made her want to hide, people approached with an awkward tenderness. Maria brought knitted booties. Señor Almeida delivered a box of buns, saying with a flowery grin that he hoped the child would like the smell of fresh bread as much as the mother. The pastor offered prayers of blessing that felt intimate rather than performative. Mariana checked in, practical as ever, helping Helena navigate maternity services and ensuring that she had the support she needed. There were tests and scans and quiet nights when Helena would wake and press her fingers to her belly in the dark, feeling a small flutter and thinking it was the truth of life making itself known. Sebastio, who had once been a man of few words, found himself speaking differently in the way that people do when a new life is imminent. More plans, more care, more talk of the future. He cleaned the gutters more often. He began to build a small cradle in the spare room, rough and lovingly made. His hands hardened by years of farm labor, learned the softness of painting tiny stars on a wooden rail. Time conspired, as time does, with joy and fear in equal measures. There were late-night fears about the past reappearing, nightmares where a camera light again seemed to set truth shivering into lies. But each small victory, the neighbor who vouched for a day at the bakery, the dentist who remembered a childhood toothache and wrote a note, added like stones to a wall that kept the worst of the wind at bay. Mariana, always practical, had arranged for a safety net the way a good architect draws plans, a local midwife who would be available, a list of neighbors who could be called on in an emergency, a simple fund that covered small but essential items. The town, now invested in the life being created, did what small towns do best. It offered the practical luxuries of human attention. When Laura was born, the farmhouse filled with a quiet that bulbs itself into memory. It was a late night when the labor started, rain on the roof, a thin sheet of lightning that kissed the valley. Helena breathed through pains she had once learned to hide from. Sebastian was beside her, steady as the rope of a swing he had mended when they first arrived at the farm. The midwife hummed, a low tone elders make over babies. The dog slept at the foot of the bed. When the child finally came, the first sound was precisely that, the small, determined cry that carries everything the world has promised and threatened. Laura's skin smelled of the salt of the sea and the newness of dawn. Word traveled the way words in a village do. At a baker's counter, in the hum of the market, across the churchyard, people came to see the child, not as an exhibition but as a kind of communal miracle. Donna Yvonne visited once more. Her face had rearranged with age, the lines deeper, the softness less obvious. She looked at her granddaughter, and then at Helena, and for a moment the old scaffolding of accusation seemed to fall away. She said little. Some apologies had been spoken before, half-made and partial, but she reached out and touched Laura's tiny hand, as if testing a fact against a new sensation. It was not the full reconciliation one might imagine in a novel. It was, instead, the small mercy of a touch that averted nothing but acknowledged something, that life persists and creates new accounts to be reconciled. The town's memory softened. People began to tell the story differently, not as a scandal, but as a testament to what patient kindness and proper advocacy can do. At the market, a man who had once repeated the brothers' gossip now told the story of a farmer who refused to be performative and instead spent months collecting witnesses and seeking truth. That narrative traveled. It changed the social currency of the place. Helena learned to make peace with the fact that healing is not a single event, but a slow accumulation of small days where a person is allowed to be herself without being measured by old accusations. She found in the routine of motherhood, in the late-night feeds, and the early morning walks across the orchard with Laura sleeping against her chest, a different kind of work that carried its own dignity. She taught the child to recognize the smell of bread and the worry lines of the pear trees. She taught Laura the names of the people who had offered shelter when the world felt thin. Sebastian found a language for pride that was not possessive. He loved the child and loved Helena in a way that asked for no absolutes, no erasure of the past, only a firm refusal to let the past determine their present. He stood in markets and said sometimes, "She bakes a good pie," as if he were pinning a medal on a life. He continued to stand when necessary, firm and steady, but he also learned the small arts of tenderness, carrying Laura in a sling, singing a wordless tune as he mended the gate. There were consequences for the brothers. The court required public clarifications. They were asked to apologize, language that they gave grudgingly, like men forced to swallow a bitter herb. The town did not gloat. Campos Verdes is neither vengeful nor triumphant. It is a place that returns to work and the weather and the small economies of neighborliness. The brothers' names faded from the center of conversation. They became, once more, characters in a neighborhood's wider tapestry. It was the quietest kind of accountability, the one that comes when the community refuses to remain complicit in rumor. Years passed in the unremarkable way years do. Seasons rotated, pear blossom into fruit, snow into spring, heat into harvest. Laura grew, a child who knew the rhythm of the orchard like a song. She toddled after chickens and learned to press her palms to the dough as if she had been born with knowledge of how to nurture yeast. The community watched, not with the petty curiosity that had once threatened to unmake Helena, but with a fondness that comes from having seen both hurt and repair. People who had once been quick to judge were among the loudest in praise of the child's first steps. Helena had days when she remembered the economy of silence her mother had taught. She had moments of fear. A phone that rang in the night, a voice on the other end that made her think of old accusations. But the tools she had acquired, friends who could speak to the truth, a lawyer who did practical work with no desire for spectacle, a husband who knew how to stand as a protector without consuming her, made the difference. Therapy and conversations and quiet nights of prayer and reading lines from a worn Bible combined into a life that, while not perfect, was steadfast. The wedding album, small and simple, sat on the farmhouse little table, a record of faces who had come. The photograph of Sebastio placing the ring on Helena's finger, both of them smiling like people who had learned an economy of joy, was framed over the mantel. There was an image of Laura on that table too, captured in the first months of her life, fist curled around a ribbon. The images were not proof that life had been cured, they were testimony that life had been protected and nurtured. In time, the town story of Helena shifted from a cautionary tale about gossip to a more complicated, humane narrative. Schoolchildren told the story differently, not about scandal, but about how neighbors ought to stand. The pastor mentioned the situation once or twice from the pulpit, not in a sermon, but as a reminder that the practice of mercy is not only spiritual but practical. Show up, speak truth, support the vulnerable. Helena, in quiet moments, thought of the moment when the farmer first stepped into the bakery and left a loaf wrapped like a secret. She thought of the nights when the television lights had seemed like fires and how a man who kept his voice measured had become the kind of defender the town had not expected. Nothing about the life she now lived erased the old hurts. They remained like indentations in a well-used table, marks that told a story of use and survival. But there was also the new grain, the ways hands could be trained to make things better, the way a community could be urged to remember facts instead of rumors. Mariana, whose work had been the hinge on which some of the practical elements turned, remained a friend. She did not become a permanent fixture in every domestic scene. She would appear when needed, a professional with a heart. She celebrated Laura's first birthday with the rest, handing Helena a small wrapped book about plants and the seasons and saying with a little laugh, "For the child who will learn to know the cycles, Helena placed the book on a shelf, right next to the Bible with the cracked spine, an emblem that life keeps both prayer and practice on the same table. There were days when the past rose up, old phrases that her mother had used, the sting of a brother's laugh, but they came less often, like residual weather, and the farm had become a climate of its own, a place where the sound of the dog at the gate and the slap of dough and the whisper of pear leaves were more constant than the echo of slander. On such days, Helena would take Laura to the orchard and point out the shapes of the branches, the way fruit takes its time. "Patience," she would say, the word learning its own quiet power. In the end, what people remembered was not only a series of actions in a public square, but the quieter pattern of care that preceded them. A man who noticed ordinary things and made them evidence of respect. A woman who, though scarred by rejection, allowed herself to be seen. A lawyer who worked without showmanship to assemble truth. Neighbors who learned to speak up in favor of what they actually knew. The town, which had been ready to feast on scandal, learned instead the more difficult work of reweaving trust. On an afternoon years later, with Laura wobbling between her parents' hands and the dog chasing a ribbon, Helena stood at the bakery counter, helping Señor Almeida line up loaves for delivery. The smell of warm bread lifted like a benediction. Someone remarked then, without malice and without the old hunger for spectacle, that they had seen how a life could be restored, not by noise but by consistency. She thought of the line from the Bible she had once traced with a flour-dusted finger, the one about making a home where there is shelter, and where the poor are fed, and she smiled in a way that felt different from relief. It was a smile that carried the knowledge that wounds can change you without defining you, that justice is an instrument but not the whole of repair, that love can be a shield and a soil in which new things root. Nobody in Campos Verdes would ever forget the week when cameras hovered and accusations were shouted in the square. Stories like that linger, but the version they told to their grandchildren became softer. They told it as a lesson about how a quiet farmer had done what no one expected. He had stood steadily and chosen truth and care over spectacle. They told it as a lesson about the dignity of work and the possibility of repair. Helena's life, baked loaves, orchard afternoons, small hands and a child's laughter, became the more enduring story. She learned, day by day, to accept that being seen did not always mean being exposed. Sometimes it meant being acknowledged. She found in the ordinary acts of care the possibility of reconstruction. She discovered that belonging is not the property of family alone, but can be extended by those who act with respect. When she thought about the long shadow the town's mistrust had once cast over her, she did not think of revenge. She thought of the small acts that steadied her. A bowl of soup on a stormy night, an attorney who would not let rumor prevail, a husband who learned how to protect without dominating. She thought, too, of the truth that remained, her life before the farm, the economy of survival she had learned, and how those experiences had shaped a tenderness she now repaid with bread and with patience. If there is a lesson in Helena's story, it is not an easy one, and it is not triumphant in a single stroke. It is a lesson about consistency, about the way a life can be rebuilt through ordinary acts made with dignity, the labor at dawn, the defense of a neighbor, the patient assembly of truth, the courage to live in the light once again. It is a lesson that the silent, steadfast act of someone who chooses to protect can redirect the trajectory of a life. On quiet evenings, when the orchard hummed and the dog lay heavy with sleep, Helena would sit on the porch and watch Laura play with a wooden spoon. She would think of how far she had come from the kitchen of her childhood, how many nights she had spent counting the cost of words said by others. She believed now that rejection, though it had carved deep channels in her, did not have to decide her course. She believed that protection offered in the right way, a shield that also lets someone keep their agency, could be the very thing that reopens a heart. The farmhouse, with its whitewashed walls and rope swing, held their days like a steady archive. It was not a palace, it was not a cure-all. It was a living room of ordinary life, arguments about whose turn it was to sweep, the smell of bread, the scuff of a wooden chair, the soft certain presence of a man who had once come for a loaf of bread and stayed to become the work that kept them safe. And in the town down the hill, at the market and at the church, people sometimes recalled how a camera once arrived and how a rumor once threatened to blow a person apart. They spoke now, more often, of the farmer who did not shout, but who, in quiet and steady ways, defended a life. They told the story of the woman who learned to be seen and of the child who learned to dance in the light of small, persistent kindness. If this story has touched you, consider sharing it with someone who needs a reminder that respect, truth, and steady love can repair what was once broken. And if you've known rejection and found restoration in unexpected places, leave a note below. Your experiences may be the steadying thing someone else needs to hear.